All right, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you all for joining us today from the many places you're tuning in from. My name is Emily Zinger. I'm the Southeast Asia Digital Librarian at Cornell University, located here in Ithaca, New York. And I am very excited to welcome you all to this second webinar in our series Across the Archives. Before I begin, I want to thank several supporters who've made today's talk possible. First, thank you to Cornell's Southeast Asia program, especially to Ava White, who is operating the SEAP Cornell account today, and she has managed the technical side of this event. Thank you, Ava. Thank you to the Committee on Research Materials on Southeast Asia and to the Southeast Asia Digital Library for additionally sponsoring this event. Thank you to the Library of Congress, in particular, Ryan Wolfson Ford, for all of their support of this talk. And lastly, thank you to all the librarians, archivists, and other specialists who have had a hand in making accessible the many collections that our speaker is going to highlight today. In my role as digital librarian, I'm keenly aware of the benefits that arise from making archival materials available, both online and in physical in-person archives. We have a duty to preserve these materials for future generations and to reduce the barriers that stand between them and the scholars, students, and curious individuals who seek to explore them. But ensuring that a collection of manuscripts is accessible and ensuring that those manuscripts are found and used, those are two very different things. And I often find that while researchers are attuned to the collections located at their own institutions, it's much more difficult for anyone with a research question to get a clear picture of all the relevant collections out there that might answer that question across the many different institutions that collect and house them. And so we conceived of this series, Across the Archives, that brings together in conversation similar collections that are held by geographically disparate institutions. And we've invited Dr. Trent Walker to speak today about the importance of several specific collections, but also to zoom out and look at the landscape of Southeast Asian manuscript collections as a whole. Our hope is that this talk today will not only enlighten you on the subject of Southeast Asian manuscripts, but will also help to deconstruct the silos within which our archival collections can become trapped. And now let me introduce our speaker. Dr. Trent Walker is Assistant Professor of Southeast Asian Studies and Thai Professor of Theravada Buddhism in the Department of Asian Languages and Culture at the University of Michigan, Ann Arbor. A specialist in Buddhism, literature, and music in Cambodia, Laos, Thailand, and Vietnam. He is the author of Until Nirvana's Time, Buddhist Songs from Cambodia, and he co-edited a major anthology, Out of the Shadows of Angkor, Cambodian Poetry, Prose, and Performance Through the Ages. Recent publications of Trent's include articles on Thai literary history, Lao and Shan exegesis, Theravada nuns, polyvernacular homiletics, Khmer epigraphy, and Vietnamese Buddhist translation. Trent also served as Director of Preservation and lead scholar for the Khmer Manuscript Heritage Project, an initiative of the Buddhist Digital Resource Center in collaboration with the École Française d'Extrême-Orient, and with generous support from a Khmer Buddhist Foundation to digitize over 1.5 million pages of Khmer, Pali, and Thai manuscripts from Cambodia. A few housekeeping rules. Please keep yourself muted during the talk. If you have any questions, put them in the chat. I will be moderating a Q&A after Trent's lecture, and I'll be keeping track of everything that's said in the chat in the meantime. Trent, I invite you to begin.
Thank you so very much, Emily. It's a real pleasure to be here. Thank you to all of you who have joined this afternoon, and thank you to those of you who might be watching this talk after the fact. I know that it was quite late for those of you in Southeast Asia. So I'm humbled by the presence of many of you here today, at least several of whom know way more about manuscripts than I do, but I'll do my best to give a broad view around why study manuscripts at all. What are some of the research questions that they might help us answer with regards to the study of Southeast Asia? What are some of the significant digital and non-digital collections of Southeast Asian manuscripts. I'll look at two interesting collections here in the United States, and I'll also say a little bit more about some of the ways I've been trying to integrate the study of manuscripts into the undergraduate classroom. Before I launch into all that, I'm just going to share my screen. It will take a moment here for it to load, so please be patient with me. So while the slides are loading, let me just take another moment to thank Emily, to thank the Southeast Asia Digital Library, to thank CORMOSEA, to thank the Southeast Asia program at Cornell University, and everyone else that's made this event possible. And so I'm really looking forward to the second part after I speak for a bit here, where hopefully I'll get a chance to engage some of your questions and insights about this material. So I've already given you a bit of the lay of the land of what I'll be talking about today. So let me jump right in. I want to begin with some of the broader questions around why we as researchers, or why we as librarians, or why we as library patrons or users of libraries might engage the study of manuscripts. And I think keeping these broader questions in mind will help us understand the usefulness of particular collections of manuscripts and how to understand them both as a researcher and also, say, from the perspective of a librarian, trying to guide users, patrons, students, researchers, and the general public through this kind of material. So there are a range of questions that we might ask about manuscripts. We might be studying a particular region in Southeast Asia, even as small as a city or a monastery. We might be studying a particular text and want to make an edition or a translation of it. In that case, we might want to find all the possible manuscripts of that text. So I'm thinking of some of my colleagues, some of which who are here, like my PhD student, Warame Malasad, who's done a wonderful study of some particular texts in Thailand and beyond connected to particular genres that feature this core Dhammakaya pericope that he's been studying and publishing about. So there, it's really important to be able to find across different manuscript collections all the different possible pieces of evidence for that. Or I think of some of my colleagues at the University of California, Berkeley. So for instance, Chao Dai, a PhD student there, has been studying some of the ways that certain bilingual Poly-Burmese texts have been translated around certain theatrical traditions. How does that, with that kind of research question, it's really important to be able to find all the different texts, all the different examples within manuscript collections of a given text. Another kind of question we could look at is thinking about a particular genre. I'll speak a little bit more about this later in connection with the Digital Library of Northern Thai manuscripts and the Digital Library of Lao manuscripts. We also might be interested in colophons and other kinds of paratextual material. Again, I'll try to bring up some examples of these questions. Another whole range of questions that sometimes people approach me about, thinking, well, you know, I'm interested in this particular word, or I'm interested in traditional ways of making food or medicine, or I'm interested in this author or a particular ethnic or religious group or some kind of technology across time and space. How might I be able to find that kind of data in manuscript collections? This is actually a much trickier kind of question. The metadata that's currently set up for manuscript collections makes it very hard to find this kind of data compared to using an index in a printed book. But hopefully in the future, it might be easier to use manuscript collections to address these kinds of issues. Or we might be thinking about the materials that are involved. This is particularly relevant for the study of manuscripts and collections in North American libraries. And I'll bring up some examples of that towards the end of the talk. And that's, of course, is true for the last question I've listed here. Questions of provenance, of circulation. Where are the manuscripts that we might be studying coming from? How have they traveled through time and space? Who are the people who have touched them, who have sold them, who have donated them, who have created them? How do we think of ourselves within that broader matrix? I'm now going to talk a little bit about some particular manuscript collections and the ways that they've been digitized across Southeast Asia and beyond. When thinking about these digital resources, I think it's important to bear in mind, what are we looking for? Are we looking for, as I mentioned before, individual texts or genres or broader questions of manuscript culture? This will affect how we use any given resource. Are we looking for something in particular language? If we're talking about mainland Southeast Asia in a Theravada Buddhist context, a whole bunch of manuscripts are going to be in Pali or in a bilingual Pali vernacular context that might not be as of much interest to those who are studying non-Buddhist topics, for instance. But there's also a wealth of manuscripts in the vernacular. How do we find our way through this maze of languages and scripts to be able to really find what we're looking for? Then there's all kinds of questions about, do we need the images for our research project, or do we really just need the metadata? And I'll bring up some examples of both of these kinds of questions. For many of the kinds of research work that I do, it's essential to be able to download the images. So that's very difficult in many ways that manuscripts have been digitized and made available for various reasons. And I'll share, again, a little bit more about that later. Then there's this question of, when we're interacting with a digital manuscript, how do we then connect that back up to print catalogs, who other kinds of resources that might shed way more light than is present in the metadata that comes with a particular digital resource. And then I won't be talking about this much now, but I know that some of my colleagues from BDRC and from other places that are working with AI and OCR and coming up with new and emergent methods for the study of, say, manuscripts from Tibet or from Southeast Asia and other contexts. And hopefully we might get a chance to talk about that dimension in the Q&A. Briefly, across mainland Southeast Asia, there's a range of manuscript collections and that have survived in various degrees. Hopefully a bit in this series later on, we might hear from an expert on Burmese manuscript traditions in Myanmar. I know that one such expert, Alexei Kirichenko, is here with us today. So if you have any questions in the Q&A, I won't be able to answer them about this dimension, but perhaps he would be able to. And it's in Myanmar where there's certainly the largest surviving collections of Southeast Asian manuscripts. The examples that I'll draw on are mostly from Cambodia, Laos, and Thailand, both in the region and in the United States. Many of you are familiar with some of these digitization projects. Of course, this is an event sponsored by the Southeast Asian Digital Library, and I won't be talking about the incredible resources that are there, but I really encourage you to check some of those resources out. It's a wonderful portal for accessing a really broad array of materials across Southeast Asia, both manuscripts and books and ephemera and images, all kinds of other things. And I'm always discovering new things each time I visit. I'll say a little bit more about the Buddhist Digital Resource Center, at least the side that interfaces with Cambodia, about this cross-Asia platform where the Digital Library of Lao manuscripts, the Digital Library of Northern Thai manuscripts are held, and DreamSea, where there's some important and quite rapidly growing collections of manuscripts from Laos, Thailand, and Indonesia. And these three currently are probably the three largest sources for digitized manuscripts from Southeast Asia. And this makes certainly an impact on the kinds of research questions one is able to ask in those contexts. But also, if the depending on how those resources are set up and the ways in which they're accessible, it can also make it very difficult to ask certain kinds of research questions. So I'll also talk a little bit about some smaller resources. There's a growing portal of the École Française d'Extrême Orient, currently for Lanma and some Khmer manuscripts, but that should be transitioning to a larger portal in the future. There are also all kinds of local projects sponsored by different universities in Southeast Asia. They're particularly numerous in Thailand. I'll bring up a couple of examples. And of course, seeing that there are many librarians among those of you who are here, several of whom that I've learned extensively from, both in the United States and Europe, you all know that there are some really exceptional collections of Southeast Asian manuscripts, many of which have been digitized to a high standard in libraries, museums, and universities across Europe, Japan, the United States, and elsewhere outside of Southeast Asia. So let me give now a brief tour of one particular manuscript collection. And this is the one project that I've been involved in the very last stage of a much longer project that really goes back to the early 1990s with this initiative of the FAMC, or the Fonds pour l'édition des manuscrits de Cambodge, which was sponsored by the FAO from 1990 to 2012, beginning from trying to recover the few manuscripts that survive between an almost total destruction, maybe as many as 95 to 98% of manuscripts that were lost in Cambodia between 1970 and 1990. So these are some of the states in which manuscripts were found in the early 1990s, sometimes buried or stored away for safekeeping during the Khmer Rouge period. And the long process led by scholars such as Olivier de Bernon, Lang Kok An, and the late Kun Sup Hiep, in terms of how to restore, catalog, and capture these images on roll film. And one result of that was this really nifty and wonderful website that's still available. You can still access this portal for manuscripts. At the time it was created, it was done with the highest quality camera work that could be done for this very difficult work of capturing roll film into digital. Of course, the technology has changed now, and looking back on this, even though the website is very well designed, it's challenging, particularly for those not familiar with this manuscript tradition, to read these texts. And it's challenging even when looking back to the original roll film. It's this particular kind of Kodak technical pan that's similar but not identical to microfilm. So the Khmer Manuscript Heritage Project, this is, again, an initiative of the Buddhist Digital Resource Center. One of the goals of that was to redigitize those films. And then another part was to digitize from directly digitize manuscripts that hadn't yet been put on film, or that had still be surviving up to the present and could be digitized in this way. And I'll just share a few images of that process. It was really a pleasure to witness I think, over 40 people that were at the height of this project that were working on it full time. And these are some of the results. They don't come across so well through PowerPoint, but happy to share with you some of the images coming out of this project. What was particularly exciting for me in this project was to be able to connect it up to the broader resources of the Buddhist Digital Resource Center. That is, to begin to imagine how these could be searched for across the broader realm of Buddhist manuscript traditions and Buddhist textual traditions more broadly, including print materials. And this portal, which is still under construction, there's still things that need to be changed. It's meant to be a trilingual portal, allows one to use the metadata as a kind of guided search to get access to the manuscripts. One can also perform other kinds of searches, but these guided searches for a particular work or particular version allows one, say, in this case, we can narrow in on what are the different texts connected to the monastic discipline or to the Vinaya. And then we can see, oh, well, there are, in this particular subset of the collection, 121 of these texts. Then one can pick through those, or see, here's a list of all the different works, of which each of which may have many different versions. And then we can see, for this particular work on connected to the rules of conduct for householders, or the rules of conduct for monastics, we get a sense of how do we navigate, how do we choose which one to study? But when we're able to view and scroll quickly through these manuscripts, it becomes much easier to choose. We can see, well, this one is complete, or this one is the particular version, or we can look for other kinds of information around the date to be able to decide that, this is the one I want to study. So in a current project I'm working on, I'm studying the development of a particular genre of sermon in Southeast Asia, this vernacular sermons on the benefits of performing certain kinds of religious acts. So under one catalog title, there are about 50 manuscripts in this collection. And here I've downloaded them all, and then quickly using the way in which they've been imaged and put into PDF in this way to quickly sort them into their different categories and see that I see that, these 22, these are all actually the different variations of the same text, whereas these 3 are a completely different text, et cetera, even though some may be complete and some may be incomplete. And from that basis, I can then go forward to produce an edition, a transcription, translation of these texts, and then begin to compare them with the many ways that we see parallels across mainland Southeast Asia. Here, for example, comparing it to an example from northern Thailand or Lan Na. I now want to turn to that region, sort of away from Cambodia, and think about 2 other digital resources that I happen to use a lot in my research. Again, because they're very large collections, it allows me to access as many sort of manuscripts as possible so that I can ask particular kinds of questions that might be much harder to ask with a smaller subset of manuscripts. So here I'm thinking particularly of the Digital Library of Lao manuscripts and the Digital Library of Northern Thai manuscripts. Here, we're in the Lao side and seeing when searching for a particular term, we can get all the manuscripts that are connected there. There's about 12,000 manuscripts in this, this particular database. And then eventually we can pull up that particular manuscript. It's now possible to download them and then engage in a serious study. I've used these resources to track questions around how is a particular genre developed over time. So the metadata in the data set for the Digital Library of Lao manuscripts and the Digital Library of Northern Thai manuscripts includes information taken from the colophons, such as dates, etc. It's not a huge amount of data, and most of it needs to be carefully checked against the manuscripts. So around, for instance, I was looking for a particular genre of text within a particular window of time. Around half of those that were listed as that window of time actually turned out to be from another period of time. The metadata was incorrect. But it was nevertheless extremely helpful to be able to quickly find all the manuscripts that would be relevant for a particular kind of research question. And on that basis, again, study some of the particular texts, transliterate them, translate them, and think about, what's the significance of, this particular text that happens to be the oldest representative of a bilingual Pali Lan Na manuscript, or in the case of Laos, this also happens to be the oldest known representative of this particular Pali Lao genre. It allows us to ask those kinds of questions. I want to talk about one more large resource here. This is DreamSea. And this is a resource that's continuing to grow and a resource that I'm continuing to learn more about. So I'll say just a little bit about it, but something that's particularly exciting for this resource when thinking about the Lao materials, this is the part of which I'm familiar with, is the really extensive metadata that's been cultivated through this resource. So when, for instance, looking through what are the particular manuscripts available in Luang Prabang, there's several thousand now through this resource that can be accessed. And when clicking into each of these manuscripts, it's a little hard to read through them quickly because, at least as far as I know, it's not possible to download the manuscripts, and readers online are always slower than manipulating these on one's own computer. But nevertheless, something that's quite exciting about this resource is many of the colophons have been translated. Sometimes there's summaries and descriptions of the manuscript content. We also, by the way, on the selection of Lao language or Isan language manuscripts from Northeast Thailand in the Southeast Asian Digital Library, we also get these very neat summaries that are quite helpful. But this allows, again, a researcher to go through a large body of material quickly. And this attention to this kind of paratextual material has been used to great effect by some researchers based out of the University of Hamburg, for instance. So here, I'm thinking of this wonderful new book by Sin Supa Deng Sawang that takes a close look at all the kinds of paratextual materials we see in this particular genre of sermon. So there's a real immediate use and application from carefully studying and putting into resources, online resources included, these kinds of paratexts. I'll just give it a brief example coming out of my own work here. also focus on this question of colophons and paratexts. This is a much, much smaller resource that I put together in the context of my dissertation. It only has 70 manuscripts, but it's for the study of Leporello manuscripts, these folded bark paper manuscripts in Cambodia. It's a useful resource because not a ton are available elsewhere, and not very many survived the Khmer Rouge period. So again, we have colophons of this material, and in the website, you can access, complete digital images of the full manuscripts from 1 to 70, as well as an outline of each of the manuscripts that gives the start and end pages of any of the identified texts that one can access the edition and translation in my other work. But crucially from this study of colophons more broadly in Southeast Asia that transcribes all that other kind of paratextual material. So again, this is just on a really small scale, but as we begin to think about, what kinds of ways can we think about these questions across Southeast Asia, then combining these kinds of digital resources together can be very effective. So there's a few more resources that I'll just mention here briefly. This is one of several resources available through the École Française d'Excellence Moyen. This is a small collection of Lana manuscripts, but it's very well curated. So even though it's a small collection, if I had a student or I had a colleague who was really interested in historical texts that dealt with in this tradition of Tamnan or chronicles from Northern Thailand, I would recommend that they come here first. You can also access some of these same manuscripts and maybe even a broader selection through a resource like the Digital Library of Northern Thai Manuscripts. But the metadata is much more precise and well curated in this context because it's a smaller resource. So again, big resources can be helpful for certain kinds of questions, but for other questions, it's really helpful to look at more curated collections. Again, as I mentioned in the beginning, particularly in Thailand, in the Northeast and the North and the South and Central Thailand in and around Bangkok, there are a ton of different new digitization initiatives. Few of them are coordinated. In other words, it's not possible now to do a search across different databases. But if one knows where to look, for instance, if one is interested in the kinds of manuscripts that are preserved in Northern Thailand, in Lanna, and in a whole range of other local languages, then what's been compiled by Chiang Mai University is a quite useful resource. One can go in, and for instance, here is an example of some of the Daikun manuscripts that are available in this collection. Again, with a very helpful description that is given so that if one is skimming through a lot of materials to try to see which one will actually help answer my research question, these kinds of resources are extremely important. Now I want to turn to the third part of my talk. I've talked a little bit about the framing of manuscripts in general. I've talked about some of these digital resources. Now I want to think about the presence of Southeast Asian manuscripts in US libraries. I'm going to focus on two collections in particular, that of the Library of Congress and at UC Berkeley. But there are many more places across the United States and beyond where these manuscripts from Southeast Asia are held in a variety of collections, some cataloged, some not yet cataloged. So for instance, there's a wonderful set of Southeast Asian manuscripts at Princeton that I've been in conversation with the curator there around how to catalog them or to come up with more accurate metadata for these manuscripts. It's a similar case for Brown, which unexpectedly has a wonderful collection of Southeast Asian manuscripts. And we might find in the context of these US libraries, some materials that might be harder to find elsewhere. So for instance, for those who are interested in studying the history of Christianity and of missionaries and of Bible translation in Southeast Asia, this is far from my own area of research, but there's some fascinating manuscripts that have been preserved in American collections. So this is an example of a 1830s Bible translation into Thai that's preserved at Brown. There are a number of other examples of this type across the United States, and some quite also interesting examples in the Vatican, among other places. What I will focus on now is two relatively small collections. Of course, the Library of Congress, the Asia division within the Library of Congress, and even the Southeast Asian manuscripts within the Library of Congress is a vast collection. I'm just focusing on one small part of it, and I'm grateful to Ryan Wolfson-Ford for sharing images of these manuscripts and giving me a chance to think about, well, how can we begin to catalog them and add some metadata so that they can be accessible for users going forward. So there's already a fair amount of material that has been cataloged that's either in Khmer or in CORMOSEA, that is in this variant of Cambodian script used in Thailand, that's available already. And then there's another portion that's sort of in the process of being cataloged that hopefully will be available in the relatively near future. So in trying to go through this, I was, creating, my first step is usually creating a spreadsheet like this to try to figure out, well, what is the title, what is the standardized title of this particular text? How does that title show up in the manuscript itself? If I was to write a summary in just a sentence, what is this particular manuscript? How do I connect it back to more searchable titles that people who might be interested, say, in a particular Northern Thai chronicle, or in a particular Pali commentarial text, or in a particular piece of Khmer literature might be able to more easily find. And sometimes manuscripts are not in order in the ways that they're cataloged. And there may be many copies or many sections of the same manuscript that end up getting different catalog numbers. And so part of my work whenever encountering a new manuscript collection that hasn't been fully cataloged is to try to make those connections, to make sure that things that were once part of the same manuscript can then be found as such by users of that particular collection. Just to bring out some highlights of this collection, in case any of you are interested and want to pursue research in this collection further, there's a fascinating collection of Rimke manuscripts. This is the Khmer version of the Ramayana. And these manuscripts are very scarce in Cambodia. It seems that they've come through the collection of, originally back to Suzanne Karpeles, who was working in the Buddhist Institute in Cambodia in the 1930s and beyond. And here we have some of these manuscripts. I have not looked at them closely other than to identify, what particular chapter and episode they are. But I don't know yet, for instance, how they differ from the published versions that are most often studied in Cambodia. Again, manuscripts can be extremely useful for understanding the history and development of certain texts, even ones that are comparatively well studied. Here's just another example of a Rimke manuscript of the Library of Congress, in this case on a bark paper leporello. There's also some fascinating examples of palm leaf manuscripts of Buddhist material. So this is a relatively late translation in a modernist mode of the Visuddhimagga in Cambodia. It stands out for this very long colophon in which 20 or 30 lay people are mentioned as sponsors. This is quite unusual in the context of a manuscript in Cambodia. We see this in other parts of Southeast Asia, but this is rare for something in Cambodia. There are also a number of manuscripts in this collection that are in Khmer or Com script that are actually from Thailand. So this is an example, probably from the late 18th century in Siam, in a particular script known as Khom Ya, of this Jataka narrative, that is a narrative of one of the past lives of the Buddha. Or we have a number of examples of manuscripts that have been annotated. So here we have the main text has been carved into the manuscript, but then at some later stage, a student or a teacher studying this manuscript has made a series of annotations, in this case, translating certain passages into another more easily understood form of Pali or into Thai. So again, this is something else that we find in this collection. I'm now going to talk briefly about one more collection. That is the Peter Corrett collection at UC Berkeley. This was generously donated to UC Berkeley upon the passing of Peter Corrett, a brilliant scholar of Lao literature. And when we look at this particular collection, it actually contains many things beyond manuscripts, books, letters, all a huge collection of photographs of manuscripts. I'm just going to focus on some of the palm leaf and bark paper manuscripts. So one thing that's distinct about this collection is a beautiful set of daikun leporellos, some produced in Myanmar, some produced in Kengtung, and some by daikun communities in other parts of Southeast Asia, particularly in northern Thailand. And because among the daikun, like among other groups in Shan State, the manuscript traditions are still quite living. In other words, people are still creating and sponsoring manuscripts on a broad scale. It's possible to find wonderful and quite intact collections of these kinds of manuscripts. So this set of examples are from mostly from the early 90s. So the colophon on this page is showing that it was copied in 1355, the Lesser Era, which is equivalent to 1993 to 1994, which explains the beautiful condition of this particular manuscript. Other libraries, such as at Cornell, also have very extensive collections of manuscripts in Kun and also in Shan. Few of which have been cataloged. So this is a whole range of manuscripts that are quite abundant, actually, outside of Southeast Asia in North American and European collections. Also in the Peter Correct collection at UC Berkeley are a set of leporellos from northern Thailand, mostly concerned with astrology. Here's just some examples of some of those folded out. And again, my gratitude to Virginia at the South and Southeast Asia Library at UC Berkeley for making these images available. And these are some of the ones that I've begun this process of cataloging. Somebody perhaps more skilled in Lao literature than myself should finish this work or correct all of my mistakes. But one of the things that's particularly abundant in this collection, given Peter Corrett's expertise in Lao narrative literature, is a bunch of complete versions of various traditional Lao verse epics. So here's just some images of the many that are available in this particular collection. And beyond the Peter Correct collection, again, there's a number of other collections at UC Berkeley, some of which have been digitized, like the Swift family collection of palm leaf manuscripts, others of which are held in the Bancroft Library, others of which are held in the Hearst Museum and Anthropology Museum on campus. And so the image here is from when I was teaching a graduate seminar on Pali at UC Berkeley. I was able to bring the students in to see and interact with these manuscripts, many of which are in Pali, so that they could get a sense of, how do the kinds of materials they've been studying in a printed form, how might they have been transmitted in more traditional formats. And this brings me to the last portion of my talk that I'll take us through, and that's this question of well, we can do research on these manuscripts. We can help orient library patrons in their use. We can think about, what are the different collections that are out there? How might they be useful for different kinds of research questions we might ask? We can also think about the landscape of Southeast Asian manuscript collections in the United States. But for me, in my own particular role, a big part of what I do is I teach, and I teach mostly undergraduates. And I'm really curious about the ways that we can use Southeast Asian manuscripts in the undergraduate classroom, where most of the students, in my case, do not know Pali or various languages of mainland Southeast Asia, but are eager to see and understand how some of the ideas that they may be learning about in a class, say, on Buddhism or a class on Southeast Asian literature might have been transmitted. How does it exist in a material form? So on the top of the screen here is a website that the students in a previous iteration of this class that I taught at Stanford created, in which they shared everything that they found out about this manuscript over the course of the term. The class was centered around a particular manuscript connected to Buddhist magic, as well as a map of the manuscript that they built. At the moment, I'm teaching a similar class at the University of Michigan. These are what some of the students are figuring out. I'm projecting images of the manuscript on the board. again, this class is centered around one particular manuscript that's connected to Buddhist magic, to be able to explore in a really hands-on way, what does this intersection between Buddhism and magic look like? Here, they're trying to, interpret the numerals of these yantra, or these magical diagrams. They're trying to understand what kind of syllables or numerals are associated with those, trying to connect these to other kinds of texts that we've learned about. Another dimension of that class is, again, figuring out, if they can, if I just give them a few tools to be able to transliterate, just say even numerals in a Southeast Asian context into Hindu-Arabic numerals, what patterns can be found. So here's some patterns within this yantra that the students are able to find. And those moments of discovery motivate both me and my students to get deeper into this material. This particular class is centered on a manuscript that probably has been lost, that no longer exists, and we only have a few photographs of it. They've been digitized and are available through the Khmer Buddhist Heritage Project through BDRC. But the images are out of order and they seem to be incomplete. And so one thing that the students are working on at the moment is trying to piece the manuscript back together from the limited evidence they have. Again, this is something that students without knowledge, like deep knowledge of these languages, can do in the undergraduate classroom, and gets them really involved in the study, and also sort of, what's at stake in the study of these kinds of manuscripts. It also offers an opportunity to study the materiality. So when I had a chance to visit Cornell and give a brief workshop on the Southeast Asian manuscripts in that collection, in conjunction with Trina Parks, a conservator at the Cornell University Library, she brought out something that was really exciting for me. That is this USB microscope, to be able to see much more closely than ever our normal digital images of what's going on in some of these particularly elaborate manuscripts from Southeast Asia. We also were using the same microscope to understand, for instance, in the case of a palm leaf manuscript, what can we tell what species of palm it is from looking closely at the structure of the cellulose? Again, these are questions that are sort of beyond my area of expertise that I find are really exciting to engage students with. I'm also really impressed with the work of the Lana Studies Center at Chiang Mai Rajabhat University, which has done an exceptional job of building a small museum around palm leaf manuscripts and the broader set of different cultures among the different ethnic groups in northern Thailand that they're connected with. And this interactive way of, say, learning how to, I spent a week with them there 2 summers ago, this way of learning how to inscribe manuscripts, to see the whole process from beginning to end, really makes it come alive. And as I bring my talk to a close here, I'll just share a few last images of students interacting with these manuscripts, some of the findings that they were able to come up with, for instance, analyzing this calendar in a language they don't understand, figuring out that it was a calendar, tying certain aspects of it to days of the week and lunar phases, using that as a basis to date the manuscript itself, and also engaging in some preliminary paleographic studies to try to understand, what set of languages or manuscripts is being represented here. So I'm going to skip this slide here. We can talk about some of these issues in the Q&A, but I just want to open it up now. Thank you so much for your attention, and sorry to go over time. I hope we have a moment to be able to discuss some of the things that are on your mind. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Trent. That was amazing. So fantastic and interesting. You covered such a broad range of materials. It was really wonderful. I'd now like to open the floor up to questions. You're able to unmute yourselves. You can also write in the chat. Does anybody have any questions they'd like to ask? While we wait for folks to maybe come up with their own questions, I have one that I'd like to start with. So you mentioned a few times collections at institutions that aren't yet cataloged, or maybe don't have a presence online, or just sort of in the very early processes of being described. As a librarian, we call those hidden collections. We know they exist, but it's not always easy to point them out to scholars. Do you have any advice for folks on how to work with those kinds of materials, or how to sniff them out while we on the back end are doing that work of cataloging?
So the first thing I would say is that for those of us who work in Southeast Asian studies in the United States and also in Europe and beyond, we're blessed with really exceptional librarians who are not only so knowledgeable, but are so eager to help library patrons, both who are at that particular institution, but also people who may be on the other side of the globe. So the first piece of advice is to reach out to these librarians. Again, they will know what's there. They may know that it hasn't been cataloged or that it, may need someone else to take a look at it. But I've found that it's been so gratifying to build those connections and learn from librarians in this field. And then to, if there's something that may need cataloging and it happens to be within my sphere of expertise, then, often that's a bridge to be able to work more closely with that kind of collection.
That's great, thank you. We've also got a question from Karen in the chat. How expensive is the process to digitize? So maybe this is something that I can speak to. I will say it's more expensive than you think. That's the easy answer. Everything, for example, that we have in the Southeast Asia Digital Library, we digitize it to very high quality. So it's not just a copy that you can access, but we make what we call preservation copies, which are very, very high high quality scans of materials that we use for digital preservation to ensure that they'll be accessible and usable over the long term. But one of the most expensive parts of digitization is actually the description. So to put something in a digital library, we don't want to just throw up a picture. We only want to do all that work to make it available if it's also findable. And that requires collecting information on each manuscript, say, about the keywords and the title and the date and the description and a summary of the content. And that description work, that's a lot of labor. And that's labor that costs money to complete. So it's always a big lift to take collections like the ones Trent discussed today and to take them from an item in your hand to the fully described version that you can see online. I've got another question from Jenny. What are students majoring in for those that are participating in trying to order the manuscripts?
So I get a range of backgrounds from the students taking my classes. Overwhelmingly so far, they're students who are not majoring in my department. They're not in the Asian languages and department program as an Asian studies major, for instance. And this to me, makes it even more exciting to work with the students because they're not coming in with necessarily any preconceptions about the material, but they're having to sort of learn these skills on the fly and then think about, well, they might not go on to study Southeast Asian manuscripts, but these same techniques of working with primary sources, of learning to think outside the box about tough problems is something that hopefully will stick with them.
We've got another question from Judith. Do you have a sense of how important some of the scattered collections in the US are in comparison with what is in the region?
This is a wonderful question and one that I think about a lot when visiting different collections across the United States. And I think it really comes down to this question of importance is really subjective. So, of course, the total number of manuscripts that are in Southeast Asia and in Southeast Asian institutions and libraries completely dwarfs that which is in the United States for essentially any genre except for some Christian materials. So, for that reason, if one is studying a particular text or genre, one needs to turn to collections in Southeast Asia. One can't answer those kinds of questions within a US context alone. On the other hand, there are some distinctive kinds of materials that are, in some cases, much easier to access or that ended up in the US in more abundant numbers than can easily be found in Southeast Asia. So one example are the large format bark paper, beautifully illuminated leporellos from central and southern Thailand, connected with end-of-life narratives, also connected with funerary rites, sometimes that have the Pratmalai narrative associated with them. These are actually, there's quite significant collections, for instance, at Harvard, at Penn, at there's a few at Princeton, at the New York Public Library, and several different collections. again, across the United States, some amazing collections. Again, at the British Library, also an extraordinary collection of these manuscripts that would be really hard to find anywhere in Thailand. So there are certain genres where what has been preserved here is quite extraordinary. There's also, I've been finding that from the period of the 1820s to 1840s, there's a scattered across US and European collections, there's a set of literary texts in Khmer, in Lao, in Thai, that have been preserved in beautiful black paper leporellos. This format actually exists in high abundance, say, in the National Library of Thailand. But outside of that collection, which is only a very small percentage of which is digitized, and there's no catalog outside of using the card catalog on site, it means that these collections outside of Thailand are actually extremely helpful and important for studying these manuscripts. There's also, the final point that I would make here is that for manuscripts that were brought quite early to the United States or Europe, say in the first half or the early part of the second half of the 19th century, they were often kept in really excellent condition, mostly because the climate in libraries in the United States may have been more favorable to manuscript preservation than some ways in which manuscripts were traditionally kept in Southeast Asia. So one might find some rare exceptional examples just by the fact that those would have been more likely to have disappeared over time in Southeast Asia. Again, that's a small answer to a big and complex question.
Thank you. We've got a two-part question from Scott in the chat. First, do you have any recommendations for digital restoration of documents that are too damaged to read? That's a good question. I don't know that I have an answer. Do you have any experience with that, Trent?
No, I don't have any experience with that. So of course, there are other, one talks about like the importance or value of manuscripts. Usually Southeast Asian manuscripts don't end up very high on this hierarchy scale, particularly outside of Southeast Asia. So for other kinds of manuscripts, and part of the reason is that most Southeast Asian manuscripts are not very old. There's something about antiquity that can bring money and interest in different ways. And of course, studying things that are old is often very important for certain kinds of research questions. So for ancient Greek works on papyrus, or for the extraordinary manuscripts in Gandhari that have been worked on by scholars at, say, the University of Washington in the United States. They're incredibly sophisticated digital restoration methods, including now being able to sort of scan through a manuscript that is too fragile to even be unrolled to be able to uncode the text on the inside. As far as I know, no such expensive, sophisticated methods have ever been applied to Southeast Asian manuscripts. And one is a question of money, but two, I think, is a question of the manuscripts that do survive. And broadly speaking, they're from the 15th to the first half of the 20th century. By far the most are from the second half of the 19th century. We know so little about the, low millions of manuscripts that do survive in Southeast Asia. Most have never been published. Most don't exist in any kind of catalog. So before one would get to the questions of, those edge cases that are very, very difficult to interpret and unravel, there's this much bigger task of, what is even there in the first place?
Yeah, that's a great answer. I think you're also starting to see some headlines that, and I don't really know anything about this, but headlines of once you scan through those documents that are too difficult to open, then using AI to bring together fragments of script and starting to figure out what's written there. And so I do think it's a very exciting time to be working in that space, but I haven't worked on it myself at all. And another question, which it looks like we have one answering in the chat, thank you, Jim, is, are there vendors who are more experienced with Southeast Asian literature and manuscripts? I know we have a lot of librarians on this call also, so anyone, please feel free to contribute.
For the non-librarians, can you describe, Emily, what a vendor is in this context?
So a digitization project has lots of different aspects to that work. And so we don't always do all of that work in-house. So sometimes we'll work with a digitization lab outside of our own universities who will actually do the photography for these projects. Sometimes we'll also work with outside vendors who help with a description and translation. You can imagine not every university can employ a librarian who speaks every Southeast Asian language. So working with outside partners, whether they are a vendor or other universities or other institutions, is a really important part of this work.
Excellent. And I would echo Jim Katz's answer in the talk here that Brecken Imaging Group, who we had a chance to work with for the BDRC project, the Khmer Buddhist Heritage project, was fantastic. And also we had a chance to work with David Wharton in that context too, who both of them contributed deep expertise to these questions.
We've got a question from Virginia, another massive supporter of Across the Archives and this event in particular. Thank you so much, Virginia, for all of your work in getting today's event off the ground. She asked, given the diversity of languages and formats of manuscripts that you know in mainland Southeast Asia and beyond, do you have any plan to offer workshops on an introduction to Southeast Asian manuscript studies as a series in an online forum?
Thank you so much, Virginia. You've encouraged me in this vein for many years, and I feel sheepish that I have not yet acted on this really excellent suggestion. I'd also like to think with sort of others who, again, know more than me about these kinds of issues, about what are the needs for these kinds of workshops and how best to do them. But I'm always keeping that in mind, and the way that you framed how to make these collections relevant to a broader public, because that's what will really ensure their longevity, their vitality, and their place in libraries and in scholarship. Thank you.
Yeah, that question, Virginia, got a lot of love in the chat, as well as a second similar question. So it seems like there is a hunger out there. We have another question from Jose. What are the strategies you employ in order to further understand the texts in any case of these damaged manuscripts? So if you don't have access to those kinds of digital restoration, are there strategies you use?
So I think the first thing to bear in mind is that there are two main types of manuscripts within the Theravada Buddhist world that I work with. That is, one, those that are copies of other texts, and two, those that are kind of bespoke creations in and of themselves. Even things that are copies of other texts might have a unique colophon, might have all kinds of other unique information. But usually, if one version, one witness, one manuscript of a particular text is damaged, we can find 30, 40, 50, 100 other examples if we know where to look. For those that are unique kinds of creations, this we really see more in the realm of astrology and ritual. We might not be able to fully answer what's going on. I think my students right now are struggling with this question of they're not going to be able to fully understand or fully restore this manuscript. What kinds of questions does that leave us with? I think it's an interesting thing to think about as well.
Thank you. And I think we've got time for one last question. This is from John in the chat. Where is OCR being used?
Please.
Oh, well, I'll just start and say that OCR is tricky in this case for two reasons. One, we're using scripts that are like a non-Roman script, and OCR doesn't always work as well with other scripts. And then second, they're handwritten. And so each manuscript has different eccentricities and quirks in the way that letters are shaped, the way that spaces are used, and all of that can make it very difficult to use OCR successfully on these types of manuscripts. But Trent, please, if you could speak to your experience as well.
Sure. So the most progress that's been made in my knowledge in sort of the sphere of Asian manuscripts more broadly in OCR and less commonly studied language. Of course, great progress is made in the case of Japanese, Chinese, Korean, etc. Is in the case of Tibetan. And now OCR for Tibetan works very well for woodblock printed materials. I think it's still a challenge for handwritten materials. OCR, just to answer that question, optical character recognition, in other words, the ability for a computer to take an image of a given text and transform it into editable Unicode characters text. A joint collaboration between scholars at a university in Cambodia and a university in Belgium has been working on how to OCR Cambodian manuscripts. So that's happening at present. They've published the initial results of their work, which is to me significant that they're able to segment out different lines and sort of understand the format of the manuscript, if not yet to the point of being able to flawlessly read what's going on there. But I think this will change rapidly in the coming years and will really change how we all are able to approach these kinds of materials.
For sure. One of my very first library jobs was a transcriber, training an AI to read one set of handwriting to generate automatic text, and that was years ago. So things have improved. That technology has improved so much even since then. So again, bringing in the AI to this kind of work, I think we're going to see a lot of really exciting developments. All right, we are over 4 o'clock, so thank you so much, everyone, for attending. Thank you, Trent, for your fantastic presentation, and thank all of you again for this very engaging question and answer here at the end. Thank you to all our sponsors and for Ava, who has kept things running in this online forum here. So please, if you have any questions still, you can send an email to myself or Trent later, and we'll also send out the recording to everyone, as well as a list of links to all of the many digital resources that were brought up in this event today. So I encourage you to go from here and explore on your own. Thank you.
Thank you all very much. And thanks so much, Emily, for being such a gracious and kind host. Thank you.